Oh, maybe she's having difficulty getting in.
Ellen, are there others that you expect to join us?
Just Judy's the one that we were anticipating.
Well, she popped up again for a second, but
Sorry about that. She arrives and then she disappears. I don't know.
All right.
We're all
thank
set
you
now.
for being here today. And I'm going to call the Human Resources and Labor Relations Committee meeting to an order and ask the clerk, Ellen, if you would, to take the roll for the meeting.
Certainly. Trustee Dobson.
Here.
And Trustee Ames will not be joining us. Trustee Flood.
Here.
Trustee Loring will not be available. Trustee McMahon.
Here.
Trustee Mishu.
Here.
Trustee Riley.
Here.
We are all set.
All right. Thank you. And I'll remind you to please leave your mic muted when you're not speaking. And we anticipate, as the agenda reflects, that we will be in executive session for a period of time, and we will need a motion for the committee to go into executive session under the provisions of 1 MRSA section 4056A to discuss the evaluation of personnel and the consideration and discussion of appointments, evaluations, employment and duties, and 1 MRSA section 4056D to discuss planning for negotiations and communications with AFM, UMSA, AXM, police, PATFA, and service and maintenance units. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All right, that's a motion and second. You have that, Ellen?
I do.
All right, and the topics
We have to
are-
take a motion. Hold on.
Oh, yep, sorry.
Trustee
Um,
Dobson. We have to vote on the motion.
Yes, we do.
Trustee Dobson.
Yes.
Trustee Flood.
Yes.
Trustee McMahon.
Yes.
Trustee Mishu.
Yes.
Trustee Riley.
Yes.
The motion is carried.
All right, we will join you in the Has everyone managed to come over? It looks like that's the case. There is one agenda item in the public part of the meeting, and that is Humane System Hiring Policies and Procedures Review Update. And this will be a perhaps somewhat extended explanation, a very important topic. And let's see. Oh, we have you with us. I have to look to see who managed to get here. Ms. Dorsey?
Yep, sure. Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to offer a review of the University of Maine system hiring practices. While I plan today to offer a summary of the report, I'm really hoping that it could be a bit more of a dialogue. So please feel free to jump in. Don't hesitate if you have any questions or you need additional information as I make my way through. I'd also like to note that our interim CHRO, Judy Ryan, is here with us in the meeting, and she will be able to answer any questions or offer additional detail as we move through. But you've all been provided a copy of the written report. So today what my plan is to give just sort of a summary of a couple of the areas of the report, the methodology that they used, a little bit of detail about the human resource area, their hiring process, findings from the review, recommendations, and next steps. But again, would be happy to go into any more detail. If there's anything that I don't mention or that you were looking for specifically, feel free to let me know. But just as a reminder, so it was in July, I believe, at the July board meeting, the board and then the chancellor had charged my office with doing a review of the hiring and recruitment practices throughout the University of Maine system for all faculty, staff, executive positions at any of the universities, at the system level, at any of our locations, centers and things like that. So a full comprehensive overview of the hiring practices. And the piece that I'd like to mention first is, while I'm the one that's actually presenting this information to you, it's really CHRO Judy Ryan and her team in the HR office that did the majority. I mean, I really cannot take credit for the amount of work and effort that was put into this review. Her team did a tremendous job on this, and Kayla Flewelling from my office, Strategic Initiatives Office, assisted them in the process, and they did a great job, and I appreciate the work that they did. So just to kick it off, the methodology that they used, they wanted to make sure that there was a really thorough evaluation of all of the current hiring practices, again, across the system, the universities, the centers, it's a broad group that we work with. And they also wanted to make sure that in addition to location, that they looked at all of the different types of employment. So temporary, part-time, full-time, internal searches, external searches, those searches that have incorporated a search waiver, or those that we use a search firm. So really wanting to make sure that every type of search was covered. Also stated were the laws and the different governing practices that we would be overseen by, and then also including external stakeholders. So executive employment, which is the area of employment that is a category relating to those who report directly to the chancellor. So when we talk about executive employment, it would be just those positions who report directly to the chancellor or the chancellor's office. And there is right now a separate governing area for executive employment, but wanted to make sure that we included that person in this interview process, all of the campuses, all of the HR leads from the campuses or the centers, but also included interviews with colleagues from those that came off of our peer system list. As you remember, not too long ago, we've looked at a new updated list of those that would be considered peers across the country. So we looked at the University of Alaska system, the Montana University system, University of Wisconsin. Shortly after the report came out, I appreciated Trustee McMahon reaching out and talking about the list that we had used and inquired about why a few perhaps, local within Maine or New England weren't considered in this review. So upon his question, I have now asked Kayla and the group to include a few more folks, including the Maine Community College system, specifically them because where they are also a system and we're trying to sort of compare more apples to apples. So they aren't included in the report that I'm offering today, but she's working on gathering that information and we'll add it to this as soon as she's done. So just sort of wanted to make that note. Just to give a little context, currently the HR department has 59 employees. This is not in the report. Chair Riley reached out with a couple of questions about the sort of structure of the HR office when she was reading the report. So I have the breakdown available for you today. So there are 59 employees, and we're considering them as FTE, so the full-time equivalent of employee positions. 38 are in the system under what we would consider our operations area, so payroll, compensation, benefits. 2 are at the system level in leadership, so it would be the CHRO and the support staff in her office. And then 19 of those are located across the campuses, serving different universities. So it's the breakdown is, I can offer it and add it to the report at any time, but happy to answer more questions about that. But in digging into this, one of the things that I found interesting, and I actually talked to Judy just today about maybe looking at a bit more, while the number of UMS employees has remained pretty much steady, the number of employees in the HR area has decreased. So it has decreased from 72 in 2015 to 59 in 2023. So that's over a 16% decrease in the number of people that are working in the HR area. But at the same time, the employee level, although it has shifted a little bit, has not, changed significantly. So while we do have some centralized services around HR, the hiring practices are somewhat decentralized and take place at the campus level with the assistance and the support of the system level HR. And part of when they were looking at this and their charge, it really is those folks are looking at making sure that they're ensuring fair and legal and respectful treatment of all of the employees throughout all phases of employment. So even through the recruitment, the onboarding and the hiring and all of that. So they really do. This office has a broad scope of work with our employee base. So in addition to the number of employees that I had just mentioned that work in HR, the searches, this is the part that Judy and I were talking about today. So job searches have increased quite significantly. So from 737 searches, that was the average in 2015, it has gone up to 1,700 in 2022. So, nearly 1,000 more searches in a year. So that's why today, Judy and I were trying to brainstorm a bit about why, what's happening, why are our searches increasing so much? And we had some ideas, really just things that are our thoughts and what we've been seeing. So I've, not really prepared to present that today, but it's something that she and I decided really should be looked into, because is it something within our system, or is it just simply, as we know, between the pandemic and some of the Great Resignation and some of these other areas, is it something that we'd find this is a trend that is consistent across the nation? So certainly something that we'll add to next steps that we didn't have listed as something in this report. Interesting as I'm reading through. The report then contains a pretty detailed look at the steps right now, the current standard recruitment process steps. I'm not going to go into detail. Those are found in the report. Happy again to, answer questions about it. But what I thought I would also, what we found in talking to our peers, some of the consistencies and inconsistencies in our system compared to what they were doing. There were a few findings in each category. But what I'd like to do is move directly into the findings of the report. One that I think is incredibly important and something that HR had talked to me about before the review started. So I was pleased to see that it is, in fact, what we found in this review. UMS hiring and recruitment areas, they really do have the appropriate procedures and practices in place. They are there, they are stated, they are accurate, and it is what they would need to be able to conduct a successful hiring and recruitment search. I think what we have found is, while the practices and procedures are in place, they are not followed consistently from search to search, or perhaps from campus to campus. So that's an area where, when we move out of the findings and into the recommendations, that we would certainly plan to spend some significant time looking at moving forward. One of the other findings was, as I mentioned earlier, executive employment. That's an area that has sort of at times been part of HR, more recently has been moved out of HR, but there has been a lot of discussion about where that particular piece of employment really belongs. Should it be a self-standing unit, or should it be something that is actually part of the HR function within that operation? So that was one of the findings, was that in other cases with peer institutions, there's typically their offices of executive employment are typically in the HR office. The other is that all of the areas, including executive employment, seem to be under-resourced in compared to our peers, as well as, with staffing and funding. I don't think that's any surprise to us, around this Zoom. We have been working under very lean conditions and attempting to, work with budget constraints. So in all areas, not just HR, I think, many of our support areas are under-resourced, but that was something that did come up as a concern when looking at our peers and others across the country. The other piece that came up that I thought was very important was that in the current application process, there does not appear to be any place where the applicant would self-disclose any information that could be really relevant to the search outcome. So anything that might talk about any particular legal investigations, or, for instance, in our situation in higher ed, we could have a vote of no confidence or something like that. There isn't any place necessarily in the current process that requires the person to come forward with those types of things. So that is a gap in our application process. Also, that those particular processes and procedures, while they are there, they exist. They aren't really housed in a place that is easily accessible. At some point, and I won't explain this because I probably will get it wrong, but I could look to Judy if she wants to help out with this piece. But at some point, those processes were moved into a certain area. They are considered EPLs, which I cannot remember what that acronym, employee practice. You're going to have to help me, Judy.
Sorry, employee relations letters.
Right, ERLs, correct, ERLs. So they were moved from the area where we're used to seeing sort of our practices and procedures in our APL area. They were moved from that, and they're all housed together in an area that is accessible to HR, but not necessarily accessible to other folks. So currently I'm chairing a search, and if I wanted to go in and have access to documents, I can go into Higher Touch. There's places I can go, but there isn't a place like we would have in the academic affairs area that looks at board policy and lists it, but then has the applicable APLs listed that align with board policy. So that was one of the findings, that things are not really housed in a place that is easily accessible for people, not consistently housed in places across different campuses, websites, and then also do not take the form of an APL, which is something that we would prefer. The next is that it relates again to what I just said, that things, while they exist, they're not organized in that accessible way. So they really should be somewhere that is a public facing area. So different people that are involved in the search can easily access them. The last that I had in the findings was that this is one of the positive findings, is that UMS HR really has developed a really robust list of templates, step-by-step instructions, best practices, things like that. And then they've really set up a structure that you could offer a robust qualitative experience for both a candidate and a search member. But again, those materials just do not appear in an easily accessible location. So recently, as I said, I'm chairing a search, and as an example, I went in and Alyssa, our HR partner at the system, took me through, off to the side, she and Roxanne showed me a whole list of resources that were available to me. I was able to pull out, rubrics that were put together so we're all scoring the same way, interview questions and best practices around setting up the interview and things like that. So very, very helpful. But those things really should be in a place where people can easily find them in one spot versus, having to go and seek out some of this sort of guidance. So those were the major 5 or 6 of the or I guess 8 of the findings. The recommendations that we have really relate to those findings. The first was that while we've done a tremendous amount of work on this review, there is still more to be done. And as it is completed, we'll make sure that things are made available in those accessible areas, that these employee relations letters are transitioned to an administrative practice letter. All of the things that would guide us, like the CBAs and collective bargaining units that we report on, those are all in one place for reference, and to be able to make sure that we are following all of those different agreements that we are supposed to. Also, that any of the forms that would be part of the application process, like the one we just discussed for perhaps any notations of violence or anything like that, have a place that are easily found on the in the application process. Another is that that all the search committee members will be trained thoroughly on this process, how to find things, how to appropriately monitor the search, and then work with HR throughout that process to make sure that things are being followed correctly. The confidentiality piece of that everyone will have confidentiality as they're training, that right now is part of the process. We really can't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we couldn't move our process forward for the search that we were in until all of the search committees went through a particular amount of training and filled out what they needed to fill out. So just making sure that that's all ready to go and that everyone is trained properly before anyone starts the search. Also, that those templates and best practice documents that we talked about, all of those things will be moved forward and put in that accessible area. And this piece, the next piece, I think is equally as important as that first recommendation, that while we find ways to ensure consistency across the process, that at the end, not just at the end, clearly HR will be involved all the way through, but that there is a very specific step at the end of every search process where the human resource person that is assigned to this search as the staff or support to the search works with the chair to go through the list of process or procedures and ensures that every step was followed. So if there is any inconsistency or any step that was skipped, anything that perhaps appears inconsistent from the way the search should be moved forward, that this HR person has the chance to sit down with the search committee, the search chair, review that, talk about it before any a conversation is made with a candidate to make an offer to, move that candidate forward in the process. So it's before any type of candidate approval has been made, to be sure everything was followed, all the information was received that was supposed to be received, and it was reviewed thoroughly. That is, I think, in addition to that first recommendation of having those consistent policies that are monitored by the HR office, that there is someone responsible for every single search that signs off after a conversation with the committee, and then says, yes, we're ready to make an offer, or we're ready to move it forward to whatever that next stage might be. That was a really quick overview of kind of the recommendations and the findings that led to those recommendations. But the report also did include an area that is kind of, what we need to do next in the area of this review, and what we need to do in looking at, or what we need to consider in looking at the HR staffing. So the group that pulled the information together had 3 options. And as I won't go into detail on all of them, but all of the 3 options include adopting, everything that we just talked about, that policies, procedures, accountability measures to make sure that, every search is evaluated, and that someone is responsible for signing off on those searches. Then it's sort of what level of change may occur next in addition to that. So does everything stay the same? Does our structure and sort of operations areas stay the same, but we just incorporate the steps in making sure there's accountability in all of our searches? Or the second option was, looking at all of those processes and procedures and accountability pieces, but also looking at executive employment and further determining where that should be housed. And then the final and third option that we're going to look at is everything above, but also looking at the current structure, the centralized HR services, but yet still having some decentralized areas at the campus that are responsible for things like their searches. And should there be a conversation about everything being centralized so that all of that has a bit more oversight. So those are three options, kind of each one getting a bit more robust, that we will continue to talk about, and we'll keep you informed as we continue the review and try to figure out, the best way to staff and structure an HR department that would cover not only our recruitment and hiring, but all of the other pieces of the work, the really important work that team does. Moving forward, as we do that and think about the best way to staff the human resource office area, we also need to, there was a few areas that I felt when Judy and I were working on it that we should kind of look at next. Onboarding and orientation. I think there are gaps in what we do when we onboard and orient our new employees. Separation and termination. Are we really following appropriate policies when there is any type of a separation or a termination of employment? I also have been more involved in areas that look at salary increases for different employment or management groups, or also equity reviews and evaluations. And I think that area is one that while everyone has a process for how they do it, I think that we should look at that and make sure that it's, again, something that is consistent across the system, and that we have the practices in place to make sure those are also fair and equitable. So a few things that as we begin to move into kind of phase 2 of looking at the hiring practices, we will start to also incorporate some of these other areas that could perhaps benefit from a deeper dive when this piece of the work is done. As I said, we're also going to add information from some of our other peers that Trustee McMahon had noted. And in talking with Chair Riley, we also looked at a little bit, she asked a few questions about waivers and the use of waivers, the policies around that. So we're going to dig into that a bit more and offer some information to make sure we haven't missed anything in that particular area. When a search, what are the conditions when a search can be waived, and how many waivers have we offered over the last few years, and for what particular situations has a waiver of the traditional practice or policy been offered? What was the reason that waiver was offered, and then how is it handled moving forward to make sure there's consistency there? That was a lot.
Can you give some examples of when you've seen a waiver used? Any standards for?
Judy?
Do you want me to say? Yes, the typical one we would have would be a waiver for somebody who, or a position that someone has to have such special skills that you can hardly find it anywhere. And sometimes you will have that right in your workforce, and you would make that decision and move that person, promote or change that person's position. That's one example. Another waiver example, I'd have to go back. Well, does that give you enough of an idea? It's special circumstances.
Well, if you have one or two more special circumstances, it would be helpful to hear them.
Hold on 1 second.
A traveling spouse.
Yes, thank you very much. Traveling spouse was another one. A trailing spouse, yes, exactly.
Trailing.
I think that I'm not coming up with another one, I'm sorry. Does that give you enough?
Yeah, I think it does.
Thank
Anyone
you.
else have any questions?
I do. I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this, and the striking numbers on staffing, even though we have no money. But I think from a board's perspective, Carolyn, I need to go up a notch. I think I understand the external processes. For an external hire, it's quite clear, the process, the posting, the 3 weeks. But I'm more concerned about how is a decision made to have an internal hiring? What are the policies around a decision to make it an internal hiring? And if it's an internal hiring, is it always posted internally for everybody in the system? A. B, how is a decision made to create an interim position? Obviously, those, I understand why we need them and when, but how do we make the decision about the choice of the interim? Are there any policies around that? How long can an interim serve? And then this whole area of executive,
Mhm.
who are those people? Who makes those decisions? Do they have the same accountability for the same policies that we're seeing here, that it has to be public, that it has to be searched?
Mhm.
I mean, at any point could, I don't have a handle on how those policy decisions are made. And are we making a decision in this that we will always do an external search?
So
If
can I
a vice chancellor or chancellor or president left, we would always do an external search. Is that a policy decision here? Sorry,
No.
Judy.
that's okay. Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah,
I
you
can-
go ahead, Judy. and then-
Yeah, that was a lot, so feel free to jump in if I miss something. But the internal hiring, usually what you'll do in that case is that you know that you have the talent within the organization somewhere, whether it's the system or whatever. And that's why you would do that particular type of
But is
search.
it a search then? There's just a decision made by a party that
Mhm.
Judy would be great for this job and we're going to hire her.
No, not necessarily, but you'd look at your workforce. Okay, mostly this happens in positions. Well, I shouldn't say that, never mind. So for instance, if you know that you have quite a number of financial aid officers within the system that have the skills and abilities and already actually are part of the system, so they might have a leg up on how you do financial aid on different campuses. That's an example of when you might say, we know we have the talent. The other thing, Chair
So
Riley.
let me just, Judy, I'm trying to, so then you would say, we think we have the talent inside, so we open up an internal search to which
Yes.
anyone can apply internally?
Anyone who's in the system. Yes.
So there isn't enough, I couldn't, as a hiring entity, say, Judy has that, we're going to hire Judy, without offering everybody else in your peer
Yes.
group an opportunity.
That's
Okay.
right.
And there's policy on that, that's clear.
Yes,
So- okay.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and while she's looking at her notes, I'll just add, so whenever there is a vacancy, wherever that vacancy comes from, so perhaps it's at a campus, let's say it's at UMF, and the UMF, campus will talk with their HR folks, those folks bring it forward to the system. So anytime there's a vacancy, it is always considered, you always start off with, there's going to be a search, and then you would look at reasons why there may not be a
That's
search.
such
So
good point, Carolyn.
every
Thank you.
vacancy starts out as, yes, there will be a search. Then it may be, they come forward and say, well, we actually, as we look at it, we're over-resourced in this area. We wouldn't need the extra person. We don't need to do the search. There has to be a justification why there would be no search, period, not filled. But then from there, it would go to, is there any justification for an internal search? And when that case is made, you could always say, well, we're going to do an internal search, which is, when it is an internal search, it's open to any system employee.
Yeah.
Then if for some reason the folks that Judy mentioned, the financial aid folks, didn't want that, they weren't interested in that different role, and there isn't someone, then you just extend it to an external. You can open it up then externally and then start to take from. So there's sort of a series of steps that you would go through, but every vacancy has to be considered under that lens. And then there is what led to this is then there is that time when someone may ask for a waiver. And the waivers I'm not as familiar with. I know Judy was looking into it, but then there is also that situation where there could be a waiver.
And who makes a waiver decision?
Again, it goes through the process of, do we need a search or not a search? And then the waiver decision is made with depending on if it's the campus or the HR partner. And then I think the final decision would be the CHRO.
Okay. Yeah. An executive search, what is that and why is that different?
Do you want to take that, Carolyn, or do you want me to?
Well, you could probably answer a bit more about what's different about the role of executive management.
Employment, is that what you mean? Executive?
Yes, executive employment.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. That is the area that reports to the chancellor's office. And the folks that are searched under that rubric or that bucket are presidents, everyone who reports to the chancellor.
Okay, so vice chancellors.
Yes.
And would they be, gosh, we do have some interim vice chancellors. What's the policy for that search? How does that work? And is that held to the same, because if it's separate, I'm just trying to get a sense.
I understand.
Yeah, they're held to the same standard. I
Yes.
think the difference here is it's the person who oversees that work
Mhm.
is not someone who is housed in HR.
Yes.
And so it's not an HR professional?
No, you're right. It's not an HR.
So is that a good idea?
Well, that, if you looked at,
Yeah,
what,
right,
our,
the options,
what,
yeah.
what our peers said, no, that
Yeah.
it really should be within the HR
Okay.
purview.
But
And-
even though they are not an HR professional that is housed in HR, they are required to follow those same practices and procedures. They,
right.
it's not a separate area where they're just kind of doing their own thing. It's
Yes,
just a person who is the lead in handling those searches and working with HR and following the HR policy.
and I think
Go ahead, sorry, Judy.
it's important to note that on every one of the searches that comes out of executive employment, there is an HR representative that sits on that search process. So, and the person who runs that out of the chancellor's office, Rowena Kluge, is very talented and partners very well with us. So if you're going to have it separate, we have a pretty good best case scenario.
Okay.
However, it's not done that way usually.
Okay. Thank you. I just needed to get sort of a sense of the big picture. So I didn't mean to get into the micromanagement of it, but the policy of it. But
Yep.
I think it's good. It's good. Your questions were good. And as we've received questions along the way, it's been good because sometimes we get so focused on what it is that we're looking at that it's hard to pull it all together.
absolutely,
Trustee-
it just gives the big picture. And is there someplace in the policy, I'm sorry, my last question, that shows exactly an issue, if someone checks references, finds information, is it clear who reports it and when? Is there a real line of accountability? Because in earlier stuff we saw, it looked more like it wasn't clear how the information was shared and by whom.
Well, one of the recommendations on this is a form that's going to be filled out early on in the process. And I think that that's going to help a lot. I think that particularly working with search firms, they often have different times when those questions are asked in different ways. And I think that we have to be more clear up front about what we need to get. Such that if it's a problem, we'll know about it early and we'll be able to take care of it early as opposed to finding out back end.
Thank you, thank you. I yield the floor.
Trustee McMahon.
Is there a specific policy that says an interim can apply for a position or an interim can't apply for a position? Because I've seen both applied during my period on the board. And I'm wondering if there is a policy, or if there isn't, should there be a policy that clarifies that situation?
So I'm answering a bit out of my scope, so I probably should say I'll get back to you on this, but to the best of my knowledge, there isn't something in our policy guide that states that specifically. It is handled on a case-by-case basis based on the situation, the role and the interim, the person moving in as the interim. But I do not believe that there is a stated procedure around that, but that is something, Judy, that I'll add that we should consider in the writing. Yeah.
Well, and I think it is done on a case by case, and oftentimes when you're starting the search process and deciding what kind of a search process you want to have, particularly if you're using a search firm, if you're really looking for external expertise that we do not have at the University of Maine system or on any of our campuses, and frankly, in the state of Maine, then you would recommend that your interim people would not be considered. And that helps everybody so that you don't have interim people coming through or internal people coming through knowing that they don't really have a shot at gaining the position.
Trustee Mitchell.
Yeah, a quick question. Looking at the different options, 1, 2, and 3, have you done an analysis of what if we accepted 1, 2, or 3, what the cost would be?
No,
next
that's a
step.
great question because today I had a wonderful text from Vice Chancellor Lowe who asked me that very same question. No, other than perhaps number one, because the first one is really adding, making public facing our documents, the things that we talked about in our recommendations, but very small changes structurally and things like that. So that would clearly have the lowest cost, but no. And it is something that as we move into the next phase, we'll clearly have to do.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad Vice Chancellor Lowe and I are on the same page. Thank you.
Trustee McMahon.
Off topic a little bit, but is there analysis of why the vacancies went from 730 to 1,700? And have we looked at that root cause before we plan on staffing at a higher level? In other words, are we taking it as a given going forwards that we're going to be at that elevated number? Or have we looked at the root cause before we do that?
No, the answer is no, we haven't really even looked into that number. I was just today, we've been preparing the report and getting things ready. And it was today actually that it sort of dawned on me that it hit me how big that number was. So I reached out to Judy and we just started talking about what could some of those causes be. And that is something that we, before the meeting today, decided we've got to dig into it and find out if it is something perhaps that relates to something we're doing internally. I don't mean the HR area, but I mean the system as a whole, or is it a nationwide trend that would compare and then it's, because of the things I had mentioned earlier, perhaps COVID or the Great Resignation or some of these things that it's happening everywhere and we're consistent with what's happening in the nation, or are we, an outlier that we've got to figure out what's going on. So no, that is something that we put at the top of the list to try and look at as we move forward. Trustee Flood.
Thank you. My question was dealing with search consultants, I guess, and it's unclear to me when a search consultant is a mandatory thing and when it's possibly up to someone to decide whether they want to use a search consultant or not. And then the other question I have on search consultants is if we have 1,000 searches that we do and we may use search consultants, say on 1,000 applications or a certain number of applications, maybe hundreds, do we bid out every single search separately, or can we lump together, get one consultant to do certain kind of searches and another consultant to do another batch of searches so that we're creating some efficiency in numbers? Again, I'm new at this, so I don't understand what it is that is our current practice, but if we have to go through a hiring process every time to hire a searcher, to hire a person, it seems like we're really pounding a lot of money when if we somehow lump things together, we might be able to get excellent searchers and maybe at a reduced cost. But I'm showing my ignorance there, I'm sure, but those are the things that I wonder about when I learn that we have that many searches that we're doing.
Trustee, I am as equally new to this topic as you, so I completely understand the questions that everyone is asking and appreciate them. And I'm just going to respond to one piece of it, and then I'll turn it over to Judy. And I wrote down a couple questions so I can prompt if we get off track. My answer is to the last part of your question. Certainly, it would make sense if we could sort of clump everything together and have one contract. There would be sort of efficiencies in scale, and that being able to do that. Unfortunately, I wouldn't see that as an option because each search is unique. And, you know, if we're using a consultant for a presidential search versus a different, we would want to work with a consulting firm that has expertise in that particular area. So even a search for an institution that is as large as, you know, UMaine versus an institution that might be smaller, while they are still presidential searches, they are just different in nature based on the candidates that we're trying to seek. So we really need people who specialize in the areas of the search. So that makes it a bit difficult to have kind of one group that we use. But
I understand that, Carolyn. I understand that. And thank you so much for the explanation. But I'm also thinking that we probably have to have various sectors of people that we're hiring. And it'd be great to have one searcher who's excellent at hiring presidents and vice
Right.
chancellors, and maybe another one that's excellent at hiring other kinds of people. But again, I don't know how often we have to go out. I know Ellen was serving on a committee to help us on a search, and they went through an independent search process to find the search consultant, and then we go through a separate process to hire someone or to find people. But if Ellen has to go through that process 25 times a year, that seems like a lot to me.
Mhm.
And if we could somehow shrink that down to a more manageable number for
yeah,
equally expert, but equally expert
yeah.
consultants.
And we actually have done a little bit of that. Procurement has gone through a process of sort of pre-qualifying. They go through a process of looking at consulting firms and asking them to respond to it. It's not an RFP. I guess I'm not sure what's the last RF blank, whatever goes in next.
Q.
Okay, there, Q.
Yes,
Um,
very good.
And so there is a list of pre-qualified consultants with their sort of area of expertise and that type of thing. So we do start there, which does help a little bit in that area.
Well-
And then Judy, to you for the number of the types of cases that we would use searches for, if you don't mind filling in those questions.
Can I just add to what you were just saying, Carolyn, and then we'll get to the next one. This spring, I think the executive employment group is going to go out and ask for search firms that would be interested in working with us, and that really allows us to find out, you know, what their cost is and what their expertise is. And so it's a really good process. So it's not as if every time we do a search, you have to go out and start from scratch. We have a list of groups that we go through. So I think that's beneficial. And then Carolyn, what was the next question?
Well, I think the beginning of I jumped to the last question that he
Okay.
had, and the beginning of his question started with what are the types of searches that would require the use of a consulting for a search
Yeah.
consultant?
Yeah, and it's presidential searches. I'm sure that there are search firms that specialize in finance work and in, you know, finding general counsels, for instance. So that's the kind of thing. And if, you know, I think one of the things that we're careful about is when we're making the decision, first off, is do you need a search firm? Because the majority of these searches, you know, are done by people who are trained and in-house, and that's how we do them. So one of the things that I would like to work with executive employment on is taking a look at over time, what has our spend been in this particular area? And is there a way that, you know, we could figure out, you know, are we using search firms to their best and highest use, and are we getting our bang for the buck out of them? And I don't have the answer to that today, but I think we could take a look at that.
So now I have a question, Judy, that is sort of related to his question. So is there a list? So if I'm looking at if I'm on a campus and I know that we have a search that we need to kick off, is there a list that I would go to that says these particular positions would require a search firm or the waiver of the use of a search firm? That is listed in the.
Well, I think we would have a list that would say, these are the search firms and here's, basic blurb about them. It
No,
doesn't
for
say,
us, do we have a
for
list?
us, yes, 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 yes.
I don't think, I'm not sure. I think that we do not have a list of positions that require a search firm.
Right. No, we don't. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I misunderstood. Yeah.
So
We
we
do
will
not.
add that
Yeah.
piece to it.
Well, the thing is that there is such a robust dialogue that goes on between the hiring folks and the campuses that I would want to make sure that we provide the lists and the best practice, but also have the dialogue. So we're not saying up front, if you're looking for a finance guy, you have to use a finance search firm.
Right.
So we need to leave a little bit of the art in the science of all this.
Thank you both. It would be nice if there was a low flow chart that a simple person like me could look at and say, okay, this
Right.
kind of search requires this, and here's where you go to
Yeah.
find that person. So
Well,
that
yeah.
it becomes clear. That's all.
And let me
Good,
just
thank you both.
say, let me just say that even I, who have worked in HR a lot in my life, when we were pulling this together, I was realizing how complex a process this is, and how much expertise you need, and how much goodwill you need between, the various people that work on this. So it was eye-opening to me. So thank you for asking for it.
Are there any other questions?
So Carolyn, as to your options, is that something you're going to continue to explore and discuss and determine if, maybe option 2, which includes both together, so you've got people who know about personnel at different levels,
Mhm.
and if you're not hiring so many executive staff, but other staff, you'd have some sharing of personnel there.
Yes, yeah. The way I look at it is I was pleased with the amount of information that we were able to gather, and some very clear next steps that would help with that accessibility and the documentation of the policies or practices and the accountability piece. That's the piece I keep going back to. But to me, that's so important that there is an area of HR that is making sure that we are doing exactly what it is that we are supposed to be doing. But then moving forward on some of the things that we've talked about today, and some of the questions that folks have raised since the report came out, digging into that a little bit more, and then moving on to some of those other areas of like onboarding and orientation, but not going much further before coming back and just continually updating you with where we're at and what we're finding, and getting feedback on our next steps as we move through the rest of this review.
And I think as a board, what we need for assurances is sort of the overview piece of when a vacancy occurs, what are the policies that cover it?
Yeah.
How is the decision made about what action happens next? And when you get to your options, I wonder if there might not be some nuance on some of them. As we just finished the budget review, Ryan, I was thinking maybe there's more that the central office can do for the small, struggling campuses that don't have the infrastructure. And I think this may be an area where we don't want to paint all universities with the same brush, because we've got, certainly at the University of Maine and USM, pretty robust systems, I assume. But the issue is, do they all follow the same policies, and do we know what they are?
Well, I certainly don't want to speak on their behalf, but I work very closely with the folks at UMaine. They've helped me on several different HR areas since I've been in this position, and they're fantastic. I mean, they're incredible, but I would say they're under-resourced, even though, we think of them as the campus that would typically be resourced, appropriately for the work that needs to be done. I think they've, as they're trying to fill vacancies and people are moving around, they are always willing to help, but I don't know that anyone is in a position to really offer a lot of additional support with the current staffing that they have.
No, that's my point. When I'm thinking, when you think about more staff, maybe where does it get targeted to have the biggest impact?
could potentially look at the model like we have with financial aid, where, you know, some of the larger campuses assist, like, as you said, the smaller campuses with some of these tasks. But yeah, I think it's been a really good process to go through, and I think was pleased with the outcome of the fact that the procedures are in place. We just need to make sure that they are fine-tuned in some of these areas of, you know, what falls into this or that is really documented.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like for us, we need when a vacancy occurs, how is the decision made for an internal, external, executive?
Yeah.
And then you've got the meat of what happens underneath that.
Yeah. And then when I would assume next steps with you all is to look at the policies that you have at the board level, and are your policies articulated in a way that support the work that we need to do, you know, at the system and the campus level? And is there anything that would need to be added to be sure, or revised to be sure that it is current in covering this work?
I think that when we first started talking about that, someone pulled out a policy. It was one very short policy. So I'm not sure if that's all that exists and whether it needs to be reviewed and
There,
more detail or not, but it ought to be part of this process.
yes, it would definitely be a next step once we feel that the system, what we've done due diligence on what we need to review at the system and the campus level. There are very few pieces of your policy that relate back to the HR area. So I think that it's a good place to look, make sure.
I think the one policy that I saw was a very good one, but it was primarily focused on equal employment.
Equal opportunity, yeah.
Very important, but not the only thing.
Right, not inclusive of everything that we might need to address.
Could I follow up on a comment that Trish just made? And on page 4, the 4th bullet, it states that HR is decentralized. We might want to make that a little clearer, because parts are centralized and parts are decentralized, and that might help people understand our two components.
So, yeah, and Judy should probably step in and give this a clearer review. But so we have a centralized HR system, but as I mentioned, pieces of the hiring, onboarding, orientation, that type of thing, that it would be handled at the campus level with their HR professionals. So in a way, while we have a centralized system, there are pieces of it that are decentralized. I don't know if, Judy, there's a specific list that you could go through and say, these are the areas. We can add that to this report, a little bit more detail about what services seem to be centralized versus decentralized. I'm not sure that I could articulate them all. You're muted, Judy.
I was following instructions, muting myself. Yeah, again, that gets to the whole complexity. I think we can take that into consideration and get back to you. There's several terms. There's decentralization, and there's also distributed. So you can have a centralized function, but you have distributed responsibility, because HR, like so many of our work, it is probably this is most perfect example of when you work with people, you got to be there. You got to have boots on the ground. So I think we could be clearer about what that definitions of those words could be clearer.
Your
So if
chart
you-
oops, sorry, I was just going to say, your chart on page 3 and 4 is great, but there's a lot of steps that comes before that first item. Are those steps outlined in other documents? Should they be included in this document?
Well, I think that they're included, Ellen, in the verbiage that's right before the grid. Under current standard recruitment process, starting on page 5.
Okay,
I can take a look.
it's items like identifying the vacancy. Who's going to chair it? Who makes the decision to chair a search? All of those steps that have to be identified before that first step.
Pre-steps, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, okay. And if it's acceptable, then I would think our next steps will we'll take the feedback that we received before today's meeting and then at the meeting today and answer some of these questions, look at some of these other areas, and perhaps at the next committee meeting, we can give an update.
And I suspect you've done this, but I wonder if it'd be useful to take a look at grievances, especially those that we lose. Are there things in our personnel policies that could protect us all to make sure that we're doing things right? And that might be a root cause analysis of its own.
Good risk assessment. Yep.
Yep.
Thank you.
And what is the scope of grievances that we would expect to include?
No, I just those personnel grievances where there's been some grievance against how we do our business. Do we have the policy? If we've lost that grievance, why?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a policy weakness? I don't know. It may not be worth it because some of those are very specific, but I'm just thinking in terms of, especially for the board, how do we protect ourselves with the best possible policies? So when somebody is aggrieved, we know that the policy has been rigorously followed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad Paul's here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we can take a look at, and especially those areas. Those mostly come up where there are terminations or severe disciplinary issues, and we can certainly look at how much HR is involved, especially those people with the most expertise, to avoid some managers who maybe act on their own and don't get the kind of support they should have in order to avoid potential liability.
President Freeney-Mundy
Is muted.
Sorry, thanks. This is not directly related, but as I was listening to Trustee Riley with her question about grievances and taking a look and listening to what happens locally, what happens centrally at the system level, I'm struck that an area with tremendous parallels to this is research compliance, research hiring. Actually, it intersects because research hiring has some different characteristics than this, because people write proposals aimed at particular individuals, so their processes for bringing those folks on board is different. So I just raised that for no particular reason other than that probably at some point a review of whatever board policy and APLs we have relative to research compliance, research employment, research accountability would be worth putting into the future plan.
Agreed. That's a really good point.
Is that a human resource? Is that an audit function because it's about risk management?
It's close to risk management, I think, but it might also be that we need some other kind of, in the near term, the immediate term, what I would recommend is, and we're working on this, is that UMaine build out its existing functions to make them more available system-wide. Because we do have all of that here for UMaine, but we're now finding we need to and want to make it more available widely, and we're looking at how to do that. So maybe it's a little more like the financial aid, but I think we're thin on board policy here.
Well, and also though, as you're saying it, there should be reference to that that's another specialized employment category.
Definitely.
That should be indicated in this list.
Yes. Very hard to hire people in these fields, by the way.
Okay, perfect. So then we will plan to offer an update at the next meeting if that chair, I think everyone moved around where they're there, Chair Dobson.
Yes, that sounds like you've got a lot of food for thought, and you may come across other things between now and then. So I think it'd be good to. Is that something that we could expect to see in a couple of months, or do you have?
Yes, I think certainly updates on the things we've talked about today and the report itself. Yes, certainly at your next meeting. I think that's
great. Good.
All right. Any other questions? thoughts? Motions to adjourn?
I had a thought. I just wanted to say thank you. That's a whole lot of work, and it's easy to ask questions of
Yeah.
people who are doing all the hard work, but that's a lot of work, and it looks to me like it's certainly heading in the right direction. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I know Judy will pass that along. Again, I am the presenter. I cannot take credit for, I was involved just a little bit compared to the Judy and the folks in her area. So I appreciate all of their hard work.
Thanks to both of you.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
We don't need a motion to adjourn.
We can just go. All right, we're free to